Thank you very much. So thank you, Praxia, for the introduction, and Julian as well. So what I'll talk about today is something around the ethics of AI debate, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and it comes specifically out of the Sherpa project, and I'll give an introduction into what Sherpa stands for in a minute. Before I do that, a quick introduction to my group, of which Praxia used to be a member. So the Center for Computing and Social Responsibility has been around for 25 years now, and we've been looking at ethical and social aspects of IT since 1996, since we started with the first Ethicomp conference. We are now a fairly large research group set in the School of Informatics and Computer Science in the Montfort University. We've got about 25 people. We run a couple of journals and a ton of projects, and I'm going to talk specifically about one. And of course, you being in Sheffield, you probably know where Leicester is, so you don't need the arrow on the left. So I'll quickly talk about the Sherpa project, just to give the context from which the insights that I will present then arise. So Sherpa stands for Shaping the Ethical Aspects of Information Technologies, a European Perspective. And we've used the term smart information systems, hence the link to information systems, to denote those types of technologies that have an aspect of artificial intelligence in them and big data analytics. So because we didn't want to get caught up in the AI debate, what is it? Even though I will get caught up in it and I will talk about it later. So we use the term SIS, Smart Information Systems. So what we try to do, and the way we've structured this document, the proposal and also the project as a whole, is we've ordered it by a number of challenges which we try to address throughout the project. So the first challenge was to get to an understanding of what actually are the ethical issues and the human rights implications of those smart information systems. And in order to answer that, we did a bunch of case studies, we did scenarios, we looked at the technical and cybersecurity side of things, and we looked at both the philosophical discourse and the legal human rights discourse. To give you an indication into what we have looked at, so these are the titles of the case studies, or the topic areas of the case studies. So we looked at organizations employing these smart information systems in various ways. So we looked at government, agriculture, science, smart cities. We looked at insurance, manufacturing, retail, trade. And if you're interested in any of those, they're all available on our website. So each of them has been published separately if you're looking for a case on any of those. We also did a set of scenarios, and by scenarios we meant a more detailed look at technologies which are on the verge of being there, which already exists, but which we expect to be more widely used in the areas you see here. So predictive policing, warfare, deepfake, education, and autonomous vehicles. Being aware that this is a big field and there's a lot of interest, we also reached out to stakeholders in various ways. We had a stakeholder board, we did a Delphi study, an online survey, and so on. And then we looked at, on the basis of our understanding of what the ethical issues are, we looked at what are the possible ways of dealing with them. So we developed a workbook, which is basically a page on our website where we collected all those insights. And more specifically, we looked at guidelines for how you deal with ethical issues and human rights issues during the research and innovation process, but also during the deployment. We looked at regulatory options, we looked at standardization, we looked at technical interventions, in particular, again, with regards to security, and we wrote terms of reference for a potential regulator. Then we tried to validate, test and validate those solutions, which basically meant we did a number of focus groups to find out what people think might work and how it might work. And then the challenge, of course, is to turn this into practice. And so we had the usual EU project, dissemination communication. And two things worth mentioning here is we had an artistic representation part of it, which included the development of a number of videos. So we have short video vignettes on the website. And we also had an artist in residence who did some exciting stuff around representation of various aspects of AI and the ethical issues in artistic practice. So for example, he developed a smart water gun, which would shoot at certain parts of the population and not at others. And finally, we also have an advocacy arm. So in the final phase of the project, which is now, so we have been running for 3 years, we only have a few months left. We have been reaching out, and we are reaching out to policymakers and decision makers to disseminate to them. So that's the background, that's the project. Now to the main topic, namely what is it that we can do in order to ensure that AI technologies, smart information systems, are beneficial. I do need to come back to the definition. So what is AI? And you'll find tons of this sort of definition out there. So the first one is from the EU white paper, a very broad policy-oriented definition, AI as a collection of technologies combining data, algorithms, and computing. And then you also find more technical definitions that look at what are the specific capabilities that an AI has to have in order to count as an AI. Well, I'll come back to the definition in a minute, because I think these two definitions demonstrate that it's difficult to say what exactly it is, what falls under this heading of AI. Before I go there, a quick look at purposes. So why do we use technologies? What are the purposes behind the deployment of AI? And I think the strongest one that you find in the literature is AI can do stuff better. It can be more efficient. It can optimize things. It allows you to extract data in ways that previously were impossible. But typically that is described in the context of organizations that try to make profit. So AI is there to help profit maximization. That is, I think, the strongest one, and you find that certainly in the UK in all policy documents now. It's going to make us loads of money, and that's a good thing. There are, however, also other reasons for using AI, other purposes. One is that of social control, and the primary example of that would probably be the Chinese credit scoring, social credit scoring system. But there are also other examples. So Zuboff's surveillance capitalism is very much around not just extracting money, but also exerting control. And then finally, and this is where we put the ethics concept, we chose the concept of human flourishing, arguing that AI can be used for human flourishing, understood as the ability of people to reach their potential, to do to live the life according to the designs that they have. So these three purposes are not necessarily contradictory, and hence the Venn diagram with the intersections. So you may very well require social control for human flourishing, and COVID is the primary example. On occasion, it may be required for people to be controlled in order to allow them to reach their potential. And similarly, maximizing profit is also something that you may very well need in order to flourish. So I'm not saying that they are contradictory or disparate, but I'm saying there are different emphases that people can use in order to, or when they think about the purposes of the use of AI. Now back to the concept of AI. What exactly is it now? And this is a figure coming out of the document you see on the left. That was a publication done by Elsevier, the publisher. And as you probably know, Elsevier is a big publisher. They own the Scopus database. They have a lot of access to publications. And they did a study, an internal study, which they published to identify what exactly is covered in the AI discourse. And they looked at different types of discourse. They looked at the scientific, at the policy discourse, at the media. And I think this figure here is specifically around the scientific discourse, and they have, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of papers that were analyzed for this. They came up with a large number of keywords, which you see, well, which you can't read, but which is the ring on the outer side of the circle. And then they try to cluster those in relevant concepts that are represented in this discourse. And interestingly, while there are some clusters, and some of those are the ones you would expect, such as machine learning, natural language processing, fuzzy logic as well, there's actually very little, if anything, that is at the core of everything that is AI. So the point here is that AI isn't so much a concept, a technology, it's more a family. It's a Wittgensteinian family resemblance, that things that have something in common, but there's nothing that they all have in common, which of course creates a problem when you think about the ethics. So what we try to do is come up with a classification of AI that is helpful in trying to understand what the ethical issues are, and in trying to understand how we can deal with them. So we suggested that there are three groups of concepts of AI that help for this classification purpose. On the one hand, we have machine learning. So this is the classical narrow AI, which is the reason for the current hype around AI. So these are artificial neural networks, deep learning related activities, typically, which are very successful in tackling problems that in the past computers couldn't do, such as natural language processing, such as pattern recognition. In addition, we would say, or we argue that the term AI is used to denote socio-technical systems which include some of the narrow AI, but which are much broader, which have a broader impact on the world around them. So these would be socio-technical systems that bring together various types of technologies in a social context. Examples might be autonomous vehicles or insurance fraud detection. So it's not just a heart of AI in a technical sense, but it's a broader use context. And then finally, we have references to general AI or artificial general intelligence or good old-fashioned AI or whatever you want to call it. So these are the technologies that are supposed to be truly human-like. Now, they don't exist. There is no such thing at the moment, but they are very prominent in the discourse, in particular with regards to ethics. So we argue that each of those types of concepts has particular types of characteristics, and these characteristics are important with regards to the ethical issues that they raise. So machine learning is opaque, it's unpredictable, it requires a lot of data, all of which translates into ethical questions that I'll come to in a moment. The converging socio-technical systems are systems that typically have high levels of impact on the world around them. That they are seen to be manipulative, they shape people and spaces of actions in a particular way, and they appear to have a certain level of autonomy. And finally, we have the artificial general intelligence, which raises all sorts of interesting questions around what does it mean to be intelligent, and that translates into questions of the nature of humanity, the nature of reality, and so on. So if we take those three main groups of concepts of AI, then we can translate those into various ethical aspects. So machine learning has particular types of ethical issues. Similarly, converging socio-technical systems raise questions about living in a digital world, and artificial general intelligence raises all sorts of, which are called here metaphysical questions, or you might use a different word, philosophical questions. Examples of those issues are, so for machine learning, that's typically one of the issues is bias generation, which may come from the data sets that are used, which then may lead to discrimination, unfair discrimination. The large amounts of data require security questions, or emphasis on security raises data protection questions. So the bigger systems raise concerns around autonomy, both the autonomy of the system, but also the autonomy of the user in the context of use. They raise questions around power. This is political power, economic power, that it has to do, or raises question around distribution of who benefits and who pays for these systems, and all sorts of broader societal questions, such as the future of warfare. And then finally, artificial general intelligence raises questions around, is it possible that we'll have superintelligence and singularity? And does this actually change the way we see ourselves, or we see the nature of humanity? So you see there's a broad range of things. For some of them, there are remedies that exist already. Some of them are technical, legal. I'm not suggesting that they're solved or easily done, but there are. So the bias and discrimination discourse, for example, is very closely linked to the explainable AI discourse, where people try to find ways of highlighting at least when there are biases, and then possibly finding something to do about it. The broader questions of living in the digital world are really not so much subject to technical solutions, but they are questions of policy, of politics, of where, what does the world look like that we want to live in? How do we distribute? What sort of policies do we have? Taxation, unemployment, and so on, to deal with some of the possible consequences of these systems. And then finally, we have philosophical questions. Now, these questions may be fundamentally unanswerable, or we certainly don't expect them to be answered very soon. What does it mean to be human, or is it possible to have a super intelligence, and how would we know whether that's the case? So we have, just like we have this broad range of issues, we have a broad range of possible ways of thinking about, and also of time spans in which they may be addressed. So what can be done about them? Just as a general overview, we distinguish between 4 different groups of mitigation measures. So we look at policy and regulatory ones, we look at organizational responses, technical and individual ones. And just to give some examples, and this field is much bigger, But on the regulatory front, we have specific regulation around AI, as most prominently the one in the EU now, the proposal for the regulation on AI. But we also have other existing legislation and regulation which may be relevant and may need to be aligned with AI, such as human rights law, competition law, and so on. On an organizational level, there are various things that companies or other organizations can do. Many of them they already do, and that may be extended to cover aspects of AI, such as risk management, impact assessments, corporate social responsibility, and so on. There are lots of technical suggestions on what can be done, from data protection and security to various ways of standardizing methodologies to design guidelines and so on. And then finally, the individual as the expert, the person who's doing the development, may be benefiting from things like frameworks, from professional support, from bespoke methodologies, and many others. So the story I'm telling is the story of complexity. We have lots of different technologies having lots of different consequences, and there are lots of different ways of dealing with them. And as the last aspect of complexity, I just throw in the stakeholders. So I'm suggesting that there are different groups of stakeholders, policy-related ones, individual ones, and organizational ones. And you name them, they're there. So this is from national governments to international organizations such as the EU, but also regulators, ethics bodies, and so on. We have loads of organizations that play a role here, from the big tech organizations who develop and deploy these technologies to all sorts of other organizations that play different roles, such as the media, who disseminate these things, professional bodies, standardization bodies, all have an influence on how these technologies play out. And then we have individuals who, in addition to being possibly in the policy world or in an organizational world, also have other roles to play, such as users, such as developers, as activists, and probably also, very importantly, also as non-users. Some people may absolutely want nothing to do with it, but they're still stakeholders in that they are likely to be affected. So where does this lead us so far? The point here being is that this is a very complex field. It's epistemologically complex. It's difficult to say what exactly the particular technologies are, how we would identify the ethical issues, what makes them ethical issues. We also have questions of the distribution of responsibility, who should look after what, how do various responsibilities fit together. And all of this is kept fluent through the technical progress, where solutions we may find today may no longer be particularly useful tomorrow because things move on. So what we need, we as societies, is probably some sort of intelligent mix of various options to deal with this complexity. And in order to think about how this could be done, we have used the metaphor of the ecosystem, the AI ecosystem, to think about how ethical issues can be perceived and also be addressed. And this metaphor of the ecosystem is very widely used in various fields, in particular in the policy field, where you find lots of references to the AI ecosystem. So what we are asking is the question of how could we move towards an ecosystem of AI that is conducive to human flourishing? So that's the question. And to give an answer, we've started to look at characteristics of ecosystems. And in looking at this, we have focused on the innovation ecosystems literature. There are certainly other literatures that one could look at, but some of these are also general systems characteristics. So what is it that makes an ecosystem that is potentially of ethical relevance? So firstly, ecosystems have unclear boundaries. So where exactly the boundary is can change over time. It may not be obvious whether something belongs within an ecosystem or outside. And that relates to its openness. So membership in an ecosystem may be fluent. Some members may leave, others may join. The innovation ecosystem literature looks very much at the question of why do systems change, and uses the concept of evolution to explain how changes or why changes can be observed in practice. Evolution as a biological term has a lot to do with competition, but it's not just that. It's also co-evolution. It's mutual support, mutual learning of ecosystem members. which points to the interdependence of the various actors. So the actors within an ecosystem are not best seen in isolation, but the interdependence needs to be taken into account. And these relationships between the actors are typically complex. So it's fairly rare, well, it's, I think, part of the systems theory in general, that linear causal chains are very difficult to establish. Typically, there are feedback mechanisms that make it very difficult to predict and assess the consequences of an intervention. So if these are the characteristics of ecosystem, then what are requirements for intervention? So how can we think about what needs to be done in order to move into this direction of human flourishing? And we're suggesting that there are three groups of of such requirements. One is to do with the delimitation. So it needs to be clear what exactly what are the boundaries of the ecosystem. And these boundaries can be geographical, they can be conceptual, they can be technical, but it needs to be clear what's in and what's out. Then within the defined ecosystem, there has to be a knowledge base. So the members of this ecosystem have to have the technical knowledge, the conceptual knowledge, the procedural knowledge to not only do the technology, develop it and use it and deploy it, but also to think about the ethical aspects, to think about how social concerns can be raised and what can be done about it. And this knowledge base needs to be maintained and updated. So there needs to be capacity building ability within the knowledge base. And finally, there is the governance of ecosystems. So governance structures need to be adaptive. They need to be flexible because of the fluid nature of the ecosystem itself. It needs to be able to learn, and it needs to facilitate what we call meta-responsibility, i.e. having a larger view of the various responsibilities that exist within the system and how they fit together and how they support each other or possibly contradict each other. So these are the three requirements, so three groups of requirements that we've come up with. And we think that they can be used in order to justify recommendations, recommendations that are meant to promote human flourishing through the use of AI. And the view, with the vision here that ethics is seen as as an integral part of AI, of the excellence of AI. So it's not like here's ethics and here's good AI, but what we're formulating here is that in order for AI to be good, it needs to consider the ethical aspects. So in practice, what does that do? So we've come up with three sets of recommendations to do with it, and they are closely related to the three types of requirements I've just talked about. So there is the delimitation side of it, there's the knowledge side of it, and there's the governance side of it. For the delimitation, we've only put one recommendation in here, which is the clarification of conceptual boundaries of the ecosystem. In terms of governance, we are suggesting three things. So we're saying that there should be a regulatory framework, and of course we're seeing that develop already in many countries, not just in the EU. In the UK, there's a whole bunch of activities around regulating AI. And we are suggesting that as part of the regulatory framework, there should be what we call an EU agency for AI. So this is the idea that there is a focal place which is the gatekeeper for valid knowledge, not just around the technical side of AI, but also for social perceptions and ethical consequences. And we're suggesting that it would be helpful to have a role on the organizational level of somebody who is responsible for the ethics aspects of AI, and we call this the AI ethics officer. All right, I just saw a comment, somebody can't read my slides. Sorry about that. It looks okay on my screen. I'll continue on. I'm almost done, and then you can ask your questions. So we are suggesting on the knowledge base, it would be helpful to have an AI impact assessment. So there needs to be a baseline of how you would think about the consequences of AI. We are suggesting that ethics by design, the guidelines specific for AI would be helpful. We're saying that training education needs to be put in place, and there needs to be guidance on what that would cover. Standardization activities need to not just look at the technical side, but include ethics. And finally, we are suggesting that there are particular security concerns that need to be addressed. So these are the three groups with the altogether 9 different suggestions. But the important point is that these need to be seen in conjunction. So while each of them individually is valuable, and if you're interested, any of them are described in more detail on our website, really what we think will be most likely to work is the package of them. So they need to be thought together, so they are interrelated. So delimitation and knowledge, for example, need to come together. It needs to be clear what the knowledge is about, and the knowledge can then inform what exactly the technology is or the use context. Similarly, knowledge, so governance may incentivize the knowledge base, the development of the knowledge base, and vice versa. The knowledge base may inform governance structures, and the governance structure will need to consider what exactly it is that is governing. So what is the delimitation? So we have the relationship between those groups. We also have relationship within those groups. So regulatory framework might mandate an AI ethics officer, or might mandate or create an AI agency. The same is true for things in the knowledge space. So if you want to run an ethics by design, you may call for an AI impact assessment. You may require training and education, draw on security, and so on. And there are also links between and across those groups. So an AI ethics officer might require education. A regulatory framework might call for an AI impact assessment. So that's it. This is a short summary of this the overview of these recommendations, which you find on our website. So we have the 3 groups there with the individual recommendations. And the argument that we put forward is that implementing these activities will not necessarily solve the problem, but they will help societies move in a direction where AI is more likely to be conducive to human flourishing rather than less so. And with that, I end. And I think the link to this book, this is an open access book, which you can just download if you so please. This is where I've described these ideas in a lot more detail. And with that, I stop, and it's open to question.